demands in what I would term a sort of extraordinary filing by the DOJ effectively highlights their own complicity in protecting the Biden family. Now, what do I mean by this? The filing that was made is in reference to Hunter's pending tax case. And in it, they basically are saying that Hunter's doing a couple things. One, he's using his old techniques of saying, oh, well, I was an active addict and I wasn't responsible for my actions at the time. But he's also trying to get certain things excluded. And specifically, any references I'm reading here, what he termed alleged improper political influence and or corruption. He wants those things excluded from his coming tax trial. Well, the DOJ doesn't want to go along with that because they want to look at part of those elements during the tax trial in terms of sources of income, etc. And they walk through a number of examples where they rebut all of Hunter's arguments. And most, but not all of those rebuttals center around Hunter's actions in Romania when he was representing Gregory Popoviciu, a corrupt Romanian businessman who had already been under trial for corruption. And they reference those activities to highlight why Hunter was doing exactly that. Well, okay, what's significant about that? Well, what the DOJ just effectively did is prove the thing that they refused to charge him for. All of the actions that they laid out effectively proved that Hunter was acting as an unregistered foreign agent. Now, you don't have to just take our word for it because the DOJ went so far as to note that themselves. And I'm going to drop down here and read what they said to kind of give the backdrop. After presenting all of the evidence, it's only a 9-page filing. Everybody can read through it. After presenting their evidence and the rebuttals to Hunter, they say the introduction of that evidence, however, does not mean that the government will also reference allegations that the defendant violated FARA and that contacts with government officials were improper. Such allegations are not relevant to the charges in this tax case. So, by the DOJ's own admission, they're acknowledging that they've effectively proven that Hunter was acting as an unregistered foreign agent all along. But because they're only charging him for tax crimes, those charges aren't relevant, so they can use the examples without charging him. In other words, everything that we've been saying all along is 100% accurate. The DOJ was running cover for Hunter Biden. I think Jonathan Turley summed it up the best. He said something to the effect of, it's like saying that we're proving that you used a car in the commission of a kidnapping crime, and we're charging you for the theft of the car and not the kidnapping.
Yeah, no, something along those lines. I thought it was interesting that David Weiss in his filing also mentions Ukraine and of course Burisma not by name but by indirectly, and he mentions China. But then, so he says, but this Hunter guy, he was up to his business dealings, in China and Ukraine, and Ukrainian industrial conglomerate and a Chinese private equity fund, business dealings, and just kind of cryptic language, but we all know where this is heading. But then he, without then going the full the whole 9 yards and going, okay, and this is what happened there, he flips, Wise does, and then gets into this Romanian stuff. And for the Romanian stuff, he does explain and he does spell it out. He says there was a government influence peddling. These guys, meaning Hunter and his associates, were trying to influence U.S. government policy while his father was vice president. That's in there. Now, what did you make of the fact that Wise is happy to spell it out for Romania, but only indirectly kind of insinuating it for China and for Ukraine?
Well, I kind of wondered about everything. First of all, there's an element in here where Weiss alleges that Hunter was concerned that lobbying work might cause political ramifications for his father. And then, of course, they prove that that's exactly what he was doing, but they don't charge him for it. But as you said, they focus primarily on Romania, but they also reference Ukraine, and then they reference China and CEFC, although only in passing. And that fund was Bohai Harvest that he started with Devon Archer, and they got all this Chinese money. I I almost didn't know what to make of this because it's so overt. Part of me wonders, although I don't want to give any credit to Weiss, who's been corrupt from the beginning, the way that he's run out the statute of limitations on all of these charges. I don't know, is he at a point where he wants to have some of this out in the open? I'm trying to understand the motivations from his part, given that he ran cover for Hunter and for Biden. Is it maybe because Biden is politically mortally wounded and he's already out of the race and is a lame duck president, and he figures he has more latitude at this point? Is it because he wants to have some of this information be made public? I'm genuinely scratching my head at the motivations behind this. It's also interesting who they're going to have testify, because if you sort of do the math, they say business associate 1 and business associate 2. But it's fairly easy to figure out who those people are. Business associate 1 is almost assuredly Rob Walker. And Rob Walker is central because his Robinson Walker LLC, one of his companies, was where almost all of the money washed into from Hunter's illicit overseas dealings. And then Rob Walker would then disseminate it from there. So it was kind of the first step in sort of, if you want to call it a money laundering scheme, a way to hide where the money came from and where it was going to. And the other guy that's being referenced, Business Associate 2, has got to be James Gilliar. And James Gilliar is another longtime Hunter associate. So they're bringing in potentially really, really damning witnesses. There's hard to find anybody more central to things than Rob Walker in this. And yet they're bringing him on the stand. It's something else.
Which is why the Hunter camp is so concerned about all this other stuff coming out. So, as you mentioned at the outset, this whole filing is about the fact that the Hunter people want to not talk about any of those things, want that all excluded. And Weiss is basically saying, well, we have to talk about it because given the tax offenses, we have to show where the money came from. And this is where it came from. And of course, Weiss, this gets us back to the point we were just talking about here. Why does Weiss mention this? So Weiss then, almost speaking indictment, this is not an indictment, it's just a filing, but almost speaking indictment like,
yes,
he puts out information that maybe technically wasn't necessary to put out. I mean, he could have said there was this scheme, and this is where the money came from. I guess I can understand that they're saying that they were paid for services to, influence U.S. government policy. Do you have to say that? This is what it's really about. Do they have to say that or not? And why is it sort of arguing, well, we're going to have to say where the money came from. But no, we're not going to talk about the influence peddling. We're not going to talk about the Foreign Registration Act for the whole FARA thing. So it's
they
very
kind of are
interesting.
talking about the influence peddling. They're not making the next step to say we're going to do anything charges wise. We're going to use that as evidence in our tax case, and that's where it dies.
It's so interesting, but as you say, it's like having your cake and eating it, because we're not going to talk about that. We didn't charge him with that. It's only tax offenses, but we are going to talk about it. And the other very interesting part about it is, so he starts off talking about why is this? It starts off talking about all the money that Hunter got from China and from Ukraine. Then he goes into great detail about Romania. And when you look at the exact language used with Romania, it very closely mirrors what happened in Ukraine. Let me just read this out here. Attempt to influence U.S. government agencies to investigate the Romanian criminal investigation of GP. And thereby cause an end to the investigation of GP. So, GP being the Romanian guy who paid all this money.
Well,
right, exactly. So you put these things side by side. What Weiss is saying about Romania, that the guy paid all this money to make the investigations go away, and then put that side by side with what we know from the emails happened in the Ukraine situation. The guy paid all this money to make all these investigations go away. We have a perfect match. So again, is that where Weiss is trying to lead us? Now, very interestingly, further down in the document, he comes back to China and Ukraine, and he says he doesn't want to talk about those because Hunter did almost no work. Almost. I thought that was a very interesting choice of words, because in a way, he seems to be kind of undermining his own argument by saying, well, in Ukraine and China, it was different because Hunter just got money for free. But he does use the word almost. So it does seem like Weiss knows and wants to tell us that Hunter did do something for that money. Now, what was that? And we know what it was in the Ukraine situation. In fact, we've talked about this before, you and I, on this show before, probably, I guess, a few months ago. I can't remember, but remember how we talked about the fact that the Ukraine situation was sort of defined by the fact that the Bidens did not do anything, just like Weiss is saying, didn't do any work, just got the money. And that carried on 2014, 15, late 15. And all of a sudden, that guy, Vadim Podjarski, the head of the board, he gets angry because Hunter isn't delivering. He isn't doing anything. And then Hunter has to do this one thing, which is get rid of the prosecutor, which he then does, or Joe Biden does. So is that what Weiss meant when he says almost no work?
Well, I think what we might be seeing is maybe that's where Weiss is trying to pick the lesser of all evils, because you and I've got timelines on everything, on China, on Romania, and on Ukraine. And the Romanian one is sort of the lesser of all evils, if you will. So I think that's why it was chosen. And, when we talked about Ukraine, obviously we've talked about that a lot. And I think a theory that we both share is that Ukraine, in every example where the Bidens have operated, Joe Biden starts foreign policy in a corrupt, generally kind of third worldish country, and Hunter immediately follows. That's the pattern. And as you said, they always try to do no work. They just want to trade off the name and get some easy money for it. And Ukraine was where things got a little weird. They weren't doing anything and they were getting money. It was a great cushy job. Hunter's getting, well over $1 million a year on the board of Burisma, and then they start getting some other money on the sides. But all of a sudden things change and they get dragged into it much further than I think we believe they ever intended to be. And that's why it's kind of been their big Achilles heel. China too, but for other reasons. But they were suddenly forced to actually do some work that I think they had no intention of doing. And that's where, Biden got hung up by bragging about, getting boosted, booting out the prosecutor. In Romania, it's much more typified of what they typically tried to do. They'd come in, they'd bring their name, they immediately get hired, the money starts flowing. And, Joe Biden maybe makes he has like one kind of public appearance. I'll get to that story a little bit later with Romania. And they just cash their checks. And so that's probably why Weiss is picking Romania. Because again, if you walk through the timeline of events between China, which extensive interaction, they left China, they were involved with China, they left China, went to Ukraine. When Ukraine was done, then they went to Romania and they came back to China. So those are more complicated stories. So I think that's probably why he picked Romania. It's the lesser of all the evils.
Yeah, I agree with you very much so, especially as far as China is concerned, because China is truly messy. Yeah. The initial money was clearly paid in sort of as an advance for future goodwill, which obviously wouldn't be surprising at all if you know how China works. You got the son here of the sitting vice president, possible future president. We're talking back in I think starting in Obama's first term and then into Obama's second term, there was every expectation, as has happened so many times throughout history, that the vice president then takes over, right? So this was a very reasonable expectation, and then you buy goodwill with these people in advance. So that was sort of the idea there. And here's where it gets super, super messy. So again, I'm trying to say that the Chinese weren't even expecting anything in return kind of immediately. This was more of a future investment. But then they did get to the point where they needed something, which was when Ho Chi Ping was arrested. Remember the guy, not my words, Hunter's words, the effing spy chief of China. He was arrested at JFK. And then the Chinese did call in a favor. Well, Ho did, but he was a high-ranking official in Hong Kong, and he had all kinds of associations in China as well on a government level. Now, then they got really greedy. This is why it gets extra messy, because Hunter wasn't going to help. He asked for an extra $1 million. It's like, okay, we can do that, but you're going to have to give me another $1 million. Which was the supposed retainer, for which we still don't know to this day what was done for that retainer. That came out in one of the previous filings from David Weiss. So anyway,
Probably
I'll just
nothing,
stop
given
there.
that when Patrick Ho called, he ended up reaching Biden's brother, right?
Yeah, he called Jim. That's right.
Reached Jim Biden, and then they just kind of like, oh, we don't have anything to do with this.
Yeah. Jim had nothing to do with anything. Yeah, just like, yeah, why would Patrick Ho Chi Ping? Why would he call Jim Biden? Jim Biden had nothing to do with anything. Anyway, that just illustrates how absolutely messy the China situation is. So I can understand Wise's perspective, maybe in terms of, well, that's going to be very difficult to, draw all these connections. I mean, not that they don't exist, but it's just such a convoluted situation. But not for Ukraine, because, as we just laid it out here a few minutes ago, there is a direct match what happened in Romania with what happened in Ukraine. In both cases, there was a criminal investigation of the principal who was paying the money to Hunter Biden, and in both cases, that guy wanted the investigations to end. It's a complete match, right? And so there, of course, it does get a lot more tricky as to why Wise doesn't talk about one, but does talk about the other. And I guess, the big elephant in the room here is that the guy who, when let me just look up the words here again, the exact words he uses. So in Romania, in the case of Romania, he says influence U.S. government agencies. It's a nice broad term, right? Well, in the Ukraine case, that goes to the heart of everything, because it's influence the viceroy of Ukraine, who at the time was Joe Biden. Remember, he'd been put in charge of Ukraine by Obama. And after the 2014 coup in Ukraine, Biden was effectively running that country. Not very well, but remember how he micromanaged everything and told them how to run their department here and run this and run that, and kept flying over there and so on.
And he created NABU.
He was
The second anti-corruption division in Ukraine. That was Joe Biden's baby.
He was the de facto leader of Ukraine. I mean, I say that without exaggeration. I mean, if anything, this Poroshenko guy who was president kept having to call him to ask, can we do this? Can we do that? After the election, remember, Biden told him to privatize a bank. That's absolute micro. That gets us into Trump and all that. We can do that some other time. But
Biden had his own reasons for wanting Privet Bank taken off the books.
Correct,
but that's a whole nother lengthy story.
It is, but that's right. But
it shows the level of control.
Exactly, and micromanaging on every level. So that's the short of it. That the guy, instead of Wise would have had to say, instead of in the Romanian case, let me read this out again, influence U.S. government agencies, it would have had to say influence the vice president of the United States, and he obviously didn't want to say that.
Well, the thing is, I guess this just goes to what the Biden family was doing. Even the Romania story is not at all clean. I'll just walk through it real quick, and people can kind of see what happened. But, Joe Biden first went there in 2014. He made this really strange trip where he went to Romania and Cyprus in a weekend. Cyprus is where Burisma had their headquarters located. So they were incorporated in Cyprus. Romania, nobody had been there forever. It was very strange. And he gave a anti-corruption speech. And this was in kind of late 2014. Fast forward to September 2nd, 2015. Hunter's name first comes into connection with the Popoviciu case, which is already undergoing. Popoviciu basically got, it was a corruption land deal. Got a lot of money really cheap through briberies, etc. The same old story. So Popoviciu's case is ongoing. All of a sudden, now Hunter, bear in mind, he's employed at Boies Flexner Schiller, something like that, his law firm. And one of the partners, Chris Boies, reaches out to him. And the subject line of the email read Popoviciu. And the message says simply, let's discuss when convenient. One of my partners is best friends with the newly appointed ambassador to Romania. Well, that best friend was probably Mark Gittenstein, who's the former ambassador to Romania and a longtime Biden, confidant. And by the way, Gittenstein is still the current ambassador to the EU under the Biden administration. So this email goes out. The next thing we know, September 2nd, that's the email, this kind of entree into the Popoviciu business. Later that same month, a meeting between Vice President Biden and Romanian President Klaus Iohannis, I might be saying that name wrong, was suddenly scheduled out of nowhere, just like we saw in Ukraine. 2 weeks after that meeting took place, in D.C., where Biden once again publicly states his satisfaction with Romania's efforts to combat corruption in the country. And that meeting was facilitated by Mark Ittenstein, the former ambassador. So 1 month later, on November 5th, Popoviciu starts making his payments into the bank accounts of Robinson Walker LLC, that holding company that's owned by Rob Walker, who's going to be testifying at this situation. So that short series of events kind of encapsulates how they operate. They see an opportunity that looks possible. Wow, this looks interesting. Maybe we can get involved in this corruption case. Joe Biden just suddenly facilitates a meeting with the Romanian president, so therefore there's the influence set. And they proceed ahead, and before you know it, Popovich is making, ultimately, I think he made $3 million in payments into Robinson Walker, including like 15 out of the 16 were done while Biden was vice president, which is important.
Very. So let's zoom out here. Where does that leave us? I mean, we're kind of where we started off from. The fact that we now have an official document out of the DOJ that confirms that Hunter Biden was in fact selling access and influence peddling within the U.S. government. It's clear as day. That's spelled out there. So for years and years, the media told us this had no. Hunter's just a businessman. He was just doing business. Got nothing to do with the U.S. government. Well, now we have the DOJ admitting it. The only thing they haven't done yet, as we just discussed, is they've admitted it for Romania, but not for the others, only indirectly, China and Ukraine. Well, I guess the huge question that's left then is, well, why wasn't he charged? Even if we just talk about Romania here, forget about the others for a moment. Why wasn't he charged with it? They're saying it happened. It says literally that they were influence peddling.
Yeah, absolutely. Tristan Levitt, who's the guy that's been, he's been representing the whistleblowers. And I sent out a tweet on this yesterday, and he responded underneath it. He's done some of his own work on this. And, one of his complaints is he says Weiss was just using the Romanian payments as evidence of intent to evade taxes. But the evidence, not allegations, as the filings point out, shows that what Hunter Biden did for Popoviciu directly violated the Foreign Agent Registration Act, the FARA. So the DOJ's own filings show that he violated FARA, but they ran those out. They ran the statute of limitations out on those, even though they knew all along that Hunter had committed those crimes. And which is why, again, we just go back to the start of this, that this DOJ filing is just unbelievable.
What makes this doubly worse, and well, we've talked about it, but I think it's worth mentioning again and again and again, is that you have people charged with FARA. Robert Mueller used that against all these Trump people to squeeze them. But none of these people, like, say, George Papadopoulos, his father wasn't the vice president. It was just some guy, and, many others. And that's the thing here. We're not just talking about a run-of-the-mill FARA charge. We're talking about a FARA charge against someone whose father was the vice president. That's just a totally different league than, from someone who they tried it with General Flynn because he once hired, he was, what was it? He had been hired to write an op-ed for Turkey, but it wasn't really Turkey. These are tiny, tiny, tiny things in comparison. Like you write an op-ed somewhere. Okay, fine. Here we have the son of the vice president directly influencing policy. And that's really the core of what this is all about. So not charging FARA, is one thing, but we're not just talking about just run-of-the-mill FARA. This is the worst FARA that you could possibly imagine, short of the president himself. So absolutely appalling. And of course, the media, once again, is totally missing in action on this story.
Yeah, and unlike, let's say some aspects of some of the other violations, there was a period of time where they could say, oh, well, Joe wasn't vice president. So 16 of the 17 payments that were sent by Popoviciu through his firm to, Hunter and his group through the Robinson Walker LLC, 16 of the 17 payments were made while Joe was vice president. And, here's an example of one of the things you talked about, policy. So when they were working on Popoviciu's case, and they weren't really working on it, just like everything else. They occasionally did a little something. But Hunter's group had Mark Gittenstein, the former ambassador of Romania, while Joe Biden is vice president. They had him reach out to his successor, the current ambassador of Romania, to check and see if they could get Romanian laws changed that would benefit Popoviciu. And we know this because there was an email, and the response that came back was Gittenstein wrote back to Hunter and the other associates, looks like this will not help your client because it cannot be retroactive. And Schwerin responded for Hunter's group. That's Eric Schwerin's kind of the money guy for Hunter, responded, "Thanks, Mark. We'll keep this to ourselves." And, Gittenstein is within Biden's inner circle. And again, as I said, he's the current ambassador to the EU. So they were literally trying to see if they could force a change in Romanian law to then go ahead and benefit Gregory Popoviciu. They weren't able to pull it off, but they tried. Bearing in mind that Joe Biden had just met with the Romanian president.
To sort of close this out, let me ask you, what do you think? Now that Biden has bowed out, he's obviously going to pardon Hunter on his way out the door. He's probably going to preemptively pardon his brother Jim and various other people. Like, what does he care at this point, right? Do you think we'll ever, you and I have tried to get to the bottom of it as best as we can, but do you think we'll ever get an official getting to the bottom of any of this, or will this just all kind of disappear?
My basic answer to that is no. I think details will come out, and we'll probably understand pretty much the full picture, I think, over time. But will there ever be like an official reckoning for this? No. The only way I could see that happening is if Biden somehow presents himself as a threat. And, boy, that seems like that would be a long shot. Every recent picture I've seen of him just seems like he's degraded further and further. I'm guessing this becomes one of those things that we slowly find out the final pieces of the puzzle, but it sort of just gets swept under and nobody cares because Biden's now in sort of the dustbin of history. And we'll see on the pardon on Hunter. But they've run out all the important charges regardless.
Yeah, but I completely agree. Even though the charges have run out, the statute of limitations has run its course. You could always, there's always a chance to still do something. But I completely agree with you. We will not have transparency. We will never get to know the full picture. Now, I think in terms of Ukraine, we've gained that picture just by hard work and over many years, just piecing together the bits and pieces of information we have. But even there, for instance, what was the extent of the Latvian involvement with the money laundering investigation of Hunter Biden's activities? That kind of ended up, we know it happened, but we never know what came of it. We never know who shut it down. We just don't know. There's so many other little bits and pieces there. The Privat Bank, we mentioned that earlier, we'll probably never find out the full extent of that. That's, and then we'll end up with, the history books will probably paint Biden as this sort of, problematic character where I think they're going to try and paint him as, he had some problems, but he tried and then he bowed out. He did the honorable thing, just kind of
genial corrupt.
But especially, as you say, if he keeps deteriorating, which it looks like he is, and it's accelerating, and by next year he'll just be locked up in his Delaware home, and then who knows what comes out. The slide has been pretty precipitous, and once he's gone, as you say, probably that's the end of it, and there won't be much interest in it either. You and I can keep looking, but who's going to care? And
one of the things we've already found is, right, you and I know this whole story pretty darn well, and right now, telling the story on Twitter, 3 months ago, it would have gotten enormous attention, and now because of where we're at with the election and with Kamala and everything, nobody cares. So there's not even any energy here. One thing I did wonder about, maybe we'll close out with this, you can finish this up. But I did wonder if this was a warning shot over the bow of Biden Inc. That as we're kind of closing out his presidency, that, hey, if you happen to have any thoughts about getting uppity about the way things went down and that you were ousted in a coup, we're just sending out a reminder that we still have an awful lot that we could bring to bear and bring out into the public purview. Just in case you were having any ideas, we're letting you know that we have this information at our disposal.
That's probably the best explanation for this new filing and how it's structured and everything we talked about, how David Weiss is having his cake and he's eating it. So he's like, no, we don't have to talk about that, but here it is anyway.
But here it is anyway.